All right, so we've looked at opposites of a number, but what about opposites of opposites? So if we let a be an integer, then the opposite of a is also a, or the negative of a negative of a is a. And what that looks like is this. We have the opposite of a. And what we can think of is two negatives make a positive. And how we're going to do this is if we have a negative negative, I'm going to say, well, two negatives make a positive, and so I convert both of those to positives, and then that's just a positive a, which is just a. So when we have the two negatives, they make a positive. So let's go down here and look at these. Well, here we have a negative of a negative 57, or the opposite of 57. Well, those two cancel, and what do we have left? Well, we just have 57 left. Okay. What about this one? We have the opposite of 121. Well, the opposite of the opposite, those are going to cancel, and we just get 121. Now, the next one gets a little more tricky because we have the opposite of the opposite of the opposite of 75. So two of them make a positive. So let's take two of them and make a positive. So those we can kind of forget about. Well, what's left? We have the opposite of 75. And so that's going to be negative 75 is going to be our simplified version. So two of them canceled, but we still had that one left, and so it comes on here with the answer. Now, what's the difference between a positive integer and a negative integer? Well, if a is some integer and it lies to the right of the origin or zero, so if we have our number line, so here's our zeros, if it lies to the right, then a is positive. So these are going to be the positive integers when a is greater than 0. Okay. Then if we have a negative integer, is if a is an integer that lies to the left of the origin, then we get a negative integer. And that means a is less than 0, because any number over here we put for a, doesn't matter, it's going to be less than this origin, which is 0. And so we'll say a is going to be less than 0 going to the left, and a is greater than 0 going to the right. So we have positive integers and our negative integers. Well, what is 0? We've got the positive integers, we got the negative integers. What is 0? Well, it's neither negative nor positive. It's just 0. So it's a special case. It's just 0. So if we look here, we've got -5, -2. What are those? Well, those are negative integers. So they're asking us which are marked positive or negative. And so negative integers, well, those are going to be -5 and -1. Then we have the positive integers, and that's going to be 2 and 7, because those are to the right of 0. And then we just have 0. Well, that's just the 0. That's that point there. Okay. So the negatives again lie to the left of 0, the positives to the right of 0, and then 0 is just 0. Now, once we've kind of thought about that, then we have to kind of go into the absolute value, because absolute value is going to be looking at negative integers and positive integers and trying to determine something. And what we're looking at with absolute value is the distance a point is from the origin, okay, or 0. And so what about you think about distance? If I go from here to Cheyenne, that's whatever, 180 miles. And if I go from Cheyenne to here, that's still 180 miles, even though I'm going the other direction. And so distance is always non-negative, because we're not going to count as a positive or a negative distance. It's always going to be a positive distance. And so these absolute value symbols, so whatever we put in here are distance of 180 miles, okay? So absolute value symbols are going to help us determine distance. And we can again think about this. We have our origin, and then we have some value a. So, maybe this is an intersection, and we're going to turn right and go 1 block, okay? So that distance is 1 block. And so what does that say? We're going 1 block to the right, and so a is 1. And because we're starting here, we're thinking we're going to the right, so we're going 1. And so that distance is 1 block. And so the absolute value of A is just A. Now, if we go and we turn left, we're going this direction. Because we're on the number line, that's the opposite of A, because this is to the right, so this is to the left, so that's the opposite of it. But that distance is still just 1 block. So the absolute value of a negative A is still A, because we want distance. And so both cases here, the negative A absolute value is A, and the absolute value of plain old A is A. And again, it's just that distance, the A distance, or 1 block here, 1 block here. We're looking at how far you went. So let's look and see about evaluating absolute values. So here we want the absolute value of -9. Well, what is -9? Well, that means we went left 9 blocks. So how far is that? Well, that distance is 9 blocks. So that's going to be 9. And so here, this becomes just a 9. What about here? Well, we have 21 is the absolute value. So that meant we went to the right 21. And that distance is just how far we went. Well, that was 21 blocks. That's 21. Now, what about this one? Well, here we have the absolute value of -293. So we went left 293. So it's a -293 from the origin here. But that distance is a positive 293 blocks. So we went 293. That's how far it was. Now, for some reason, the tab disappeared here, but this one's a little different. It doesn't have absolute values. It just has these parentheses. So this is kind of thrown in to see if you're paying attention. And so now we just have the opposite of 18. Well, remember, opposite of the opposite. Now these parentheses, they don't have anything mathematical we have to do. Parentheses just means they're separating something from something else. And so we can have the opposite becomes positive, and so that just becomes 18. Now, because we had that in, we have to also think about, well, what does this one say? Here we have the opposite of the absolute value of the opposite of 95, or a -95. Well, absolute value symbols here, that means you have to do something. Whereas parentheses, you don't have to do anything. So that means we have to work inside those absolute value symbols first before we can worry about that negative. So right now, all we're going to worry about is what is inside the box. So we're going to say, well, that equals, and we're just going to bring what's up front here. Now we want the absolute value of a -95. Well, that's just finding out. Okay, well, we went left 95 blocks. So what's the absolute value of -95? Well, that's 95. And so we can put that now in parentheses. And now what we've done is we've simplified the absolute value. We left the negative out front. And so now we have this. What it says now is take the opposite of 95. And so that's going to be -95. So having parentheses here versus having absolute value here does a lot of difference. So you have to really pay attention to what your symbols are, because parentheses, you're not doing anything. It's just a separator. And so you do the opposite of the opposite and you get 18. But you can't go across the absolute value symbols. Whatever's an absolute value symbols, you have to do that first and get your 95. And then you can apply that negative to it and we get the -95. So key things, difference here between 4 and 5 on how they work. All right, so I'll stop here and then come back in a little bit.